Donald Trump walks into Secret Service headquarters. What he finds shocks everyone. Washington, D.C., on a bitterly cold winter day. The air inside the United States Secret Service headquarters was thick with tension, the kind that never truly left the building. Agents moved with quiet urgency, their eyes locked on surveillance monitors, hands typing up classified reports, voices low and controlled. The hum of ringing phones and distant conversations filled the space, each person focused on their mission until the heavy front doors swung open. The room didn't just quiet, it froze. No prior notice, no security detail, just a man whose presence needed no introduction. Donald Trump had arrived. For a brief moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Agents exchanged puzzled glances, their training urging them to remain composed, but the surprise was undeniable. A high-profile figure like Trump never entered a facility like this without layers of planning, protocol, and advanced security sweeps. Yet here he was, standing at the entrance as if he belonged there more than anyone else in the room. A voice finally broke the silence. "Mr. Trump, what brings you here?" Trump's gaze swept across the room, sharp and unwavering, taking in the sight of men and women trained to guard the most powerful figures in the country. But today, it wasn't about them. It wasn't about politics or power plays. It was about a question that had haunted him for decades. "I need to find someone," he said, his voice firm, controlled. "An agent who saved my life years ago, but his name has been erased from every record." He let the words settle, his next statement leaving no room for doubt. "I won't leave here until I know the truth." A heavy silence fell over the room. Agents exchanged uncertain glances, shifting in their seats. Some turned toward Jonathan Reyes, the director of the Secret Service, waiting for his response. Reyes, a seasoned leader who had served under multiple presidents, stepped forward. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he already knew this wasn't just another request. "An agent saved your life?" he asked carefully. "Mr. President, tell me more." Trump nodded, glancing around as if ensuring every ear in the room would catch what he was about to say. Then he took a slow breath and began. "It was 1982, he said, his voice dipping lower. "I was a young businessman, expanding my empire. Back then, I thought success was about numbers, skyscrapers, million-dollar deals." His jaw tensed, eyes narrowing slightly. "I never imagined that one night I'd be standing face to face with death." The room remained still. No one spoke, no one moved. They just listened. Because whatever happened that night wasn't just business. It was something far bigger. And as Trump's story unfolded, the search for a long-lost name had just begun. Trump's voice carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. It wasn't the tone of a man telling a simple memory. It was something deeper, something that had stayed with him for decades. He exhaled slowly, his gaze distant, as if the room itself had faded, replaced by a long-buried night in New York City. "That night I had just left an important meeting," he continued, his voice measured but firm. "It was late, maybe past midnight. The streets were quiet but not empty. I didn't think twice as I walked to my car, started the engine and pulled onto the road. Back then I didn't believe in looking over my shoulder. I was young, untouchable, or at least I thought I was." He paused, the memory tightening in his throat. The agents in the room weren't just listening now, they were locked in, their years of experience telling them that what came next wasn't just another story. "I turned down a narrow alley, taking a shortcut toward Fifth Avenue," Trump continued. "That's when I saw it, headlights in my rear-view mirror, moving too fast, too close. Before I could react, an SUV swerved in front of me, cutting me off. My brakes screamed against the pavement, but it was too late. The vehicle stopped hard, blocking my path. And then, the doors opened. The silence in the room thickened. Reyes stood motionless, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "4 men stepped out," Trump said. "All armed, all moving with purpose. This wasn't a robbery. They weren't after my wallet or my car. They were after me." His fingers clenched at his side, as if reliving the moment when rough hands had yanked open his door, dragging him onto the cold pavement. "They threw me down," he said, jaw tightening. "One of them pressed a gun to my head. I could feel the barrel, cold, steady, and then he spoke. Trump's voice dropped to a near whisper, mimicking the chilling words he had heard that night. "You think you can walk into our world without paying the price?" Reyes exhaled sharply. He had been in this line of work long enough to recognize what Trump was describing. This wasn't some random act of violence. It was a message. "At the time, I had no idea who they were," Trump admitted. "But later I learned the truth. They were part of something bigger, a powerful organization that controlled entire industries in New York's underground. And without realizing it, I had stepped into their territory." He let the words hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. "The night. They weren't just planning to scare me," he said, his gaze cutting through the room. "They were planning to end me." The agents remained motionless, absorbing the weight of his words. But then Trump's expression shifted, because what happened next wasn't just about him. It was about the man who had changed everything. And the search for him was only beginning. Just when Trump thought it was over, that his life would end in the cold silence of that alley, a voice cut through the night. "Drop your weapons." It wasn't a yell, it wasn't a plea, it was a command, calm, controlled, lethal. For a second, no one moved. The men surrounding Trump exchanged quick glances, their fingers tightening around their triggers. Then one of them laughed. "Walk away." The man sneered into the darkness, pressing the barrel of his gun harder against Trump's temple. "This ain't your fight." A single gunshot rang out. The man with the gun stumbled back, screaming in pain. Blood dripped from his hand, his weapon clattering to the pavement. Before the others could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, swift, precise, and merciless. Trump barely registered what happened next. The air filled with the brutal, sharp sounds of combat, bones cracking, bodies hitting the pavement. The men who had been in complete control just seconds ago were now scrambling, desperate, trying to fight back against someone they couldn't even see coming. In the chaos, a firm grip seized Trump's arm. "Move." The voice was rough, steady, urgent. No hesitation, no panic, just absolute control. Trump didn't question it. He ran. The stranger pulled him through the alley, weaving through narrow passageways, cutting across dimly lit streets. Trump's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. He could hear the distant shouts of the men behind them, but they were fading, growing more distant with every step. Finally, they stopped in a darkened side street, hidden from view. Only then did Trump get his first real look at the man who had just saved his life. He wasn't some towering figure, wasn't covered in tactical gear like the security teams Trump had grown accustomed to seeing. He wore a dark, unremarkable jacket, the kind that blended into any crowd. But it was his presence, his absolute, unwavering focus that made him stand out. A thin scar ran along his left hand, barely visible in the dim streetlight. His eyes, sharp and alert, scanned their surroundings before finally settling on Trump. "You're safe now," he said. Trump took a breath, steadying himself. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced back toward the alley, as if making sure the threat had truly passed. Then, finally, he spoke. "Shadow 1. And just like that, he was gone. Trump blinked, barely processing what had happened. 1 second the man had been there, and the next he had melted back into the night, leaving only questions in his wake. And for years, those questions remained unanswered. Until now. Trump stood there for a long moment, his breath still heavy from the chase, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The alley was empty now. The men who had come for him had vanished, scattered into the night, and the only proof that any of it had happened was the faint echo of sirens in the distance. And the man who had saved him, Shadow 1, was gone. The name burned itself into Trump's memory. But no matter how many times he replayed that night in his mind, no matter how many people he asked, there were no answers. Shadow 1 did not exist. Trump had access to the most powerful networks, the highest-ranking officials, the deepest vaults of government intelligence, but every attempt to uncover the identity of the man who had saved him led to nothing. No records, no files, no trace. It was as if the man had been erased from history. Years passed. Trump built his empire, his name rising in the business world, then later in politics. But through it all, the memory of that night never faded, and neither did the question. Who was Shadow 1? Now, standing in the heart of the Secret Service headquarters, Trump faced a room full of the most highly trained agents in the world. These were the people who were supposed to know everything, who could find anyone, anywhere. But when he spoke the name, the reaction told him everything. Silence. Not confusion, not curiosity. Fear. Director Jonathan Reyes was the first to speak. "Mr. President, are you certain about this?" Trump's gaze remained firm. "I don't say things I'm not certain about." Reyes exhaled, glancing at his team. There was hesitation in his eyes, but something else too. Something Trump had learned to recognize. "Oh, Baronet!" He knew something. "Shadow One isn't just a name," Reyes finally said. His voice was low, careful. "It's a ghost story." The agents exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Trump's patience thinned. "I don't care what you call it. I want answers." Reyes hesitated, then gave a short nod. "I'll need time. You have 24 hours. For a moment no one moved. Then, as if a silent order had been given, the room snapped into action. Agents rushed to terminals, files were pulled, databases accessed. The search had begun. But Trump knew one thing for certain. If Shadow One had been erased, it wasn't by accident. And now he was about to find out why. The hum of computer servers filled the Secret Service command center, a low, steady rhythm beneath the frantic keystrokes of analysts combing through decades of classified records. Agents moved with urgency, speaking in hushed voices, scanning old intelligence reports, mission logs, and erased files, anything that might contain even a trace of Shadow One. Trump stood motionless, arms crossed, his gaze locked onto the flickering screens. The energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't just a search, it was a battle against something deliberately hidden, something that wasn't meant to resurface. Reyes leaned over an analyst's desk, watching as the system crawled through encrypted archives. "Anything?" The analyst swallowed hard. "Sir, there's nothing." Reyes's jaw clenched. "Keep looking." Trump didn't react, but he could see it, the resistance, the gaps in information that shouldn't exist. If Shadow One had truly been erased, someone had made sure of it. A younger agent suddenly turned from his screen. "Director, I might have something." Reyes and Trump moved toward the terminal as the agent brought up an old personnel report from the early 1000s, 980 SS. The name on the file had been scrubbed, but a faded photo remained, a grainy black and white image of a man in a suit, his face partially obscured. Beneath the image, a single word stood out: decommissioned. Trump narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" Reyes hesitated. "It means he was removed from service, not retired, not reassigned, completely wiped." Trump wasn't satisfied. "And where does a decommissioned agent go?" Reyes sighed. "If he's still alive, off the grid." A heavy silence fell over the room. The implications were clear. If Shadow One had been taken off the books, it wasn't because he had failed. It was because he had become a problem. Trump turned to Reyes, his voice sharp. "Someone knows where he is. Find them." Reyes exhaled, his expression unreadable. "There's only one man who might remember, but he's not easy to reach." Trump raised a brow. "Who?" Reyes glanced at his team, then back at Trump. "Michael Hayes, former deep cover operative, retired in '95. If anyone knew Shadow One, it was him." Trump didn't hesitate. "Where is he?" Reyes smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Off the radar, just like the man we're looking for." Trump's voice was cold. "Then it's time to put him back on." The search wasn't over. It was just beginning. The reinforced SUV rumbled down a narrow road, flanked by thick Virginia woods. The world outside was quiet, untouched, but inside the air was heavy with tension. Trump sat in the passenger seat, his jaw set, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest. Reyes was behind the wheel, his grip firm, his gaze locked straight ahead. Michael Hayes, a name long buried in the intelligence community, whispered in old corridors but never spoken outright. If he knew anything about Shadow One, they needed to find him, and fast. "He doesn't want to be found." Reyes muttered, eyes flicking toward Trump. Men like him? They disappear for a reason. Trump didn't waver, and I have mine for finding him. The car slowed as they approached an aging house, barely visible through the trees. It was the kind of place where someone who didn't want company lived, modest, isolated, and secure. The windows were reinforced, the locks custom-made. A man like Hayes never stopped being cautious. Reyes stepped out first, approaching the door with measured steps. He knocked once, firm but not aggressive. Silence. Then a voice, hoarse but steady, from inside. "Go away." Reyes exhaled sharply. "Michael, open the door, we need to talk." A long pause. Then, click. The door creaked open, just enough to reveal a man in his 60s, silver-streaked hair framing a face hardened by years of survival. His eyes flickered from Reyes to Trump, calculating, untrusting. "You've got 3 seconds to tell me why you're here, before I decide you're not worth my time." Trump met his gaze, unwavering. "Shadow 1. Something flashed in Hayes' expression, just for a second. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He started closing the door. "Not my problem." Trump caught the edge with his palm, his voice calm but firm. "It is if you care about the truth." Hayes studied him, then raised, then sighed. The door opened wider. Inside, now. They stepped into a dimly lit room filled with stacks of old files and yellowed photographs lining the walls. There was no TV, no distractions, just a man and the weight of a past he never fully escaped. Reyes crossed his arms. "You knew him." Hayes sat down, his movements slow but deliberate. "I did." His voice was quieter now, almost distant. "But you're asking the wrong question." Trump frowned. "Then what's the right one?" Hayes leaned forward, his gaze dark. Not where he is, why he'd disappeared. The weight of those words settled over the room like a shadow. Whatever had happened to Shadow 1, it hadn't been by accident. And finding him might uncover more than any of them were ready for. Trump leaned forward, his gaze locked on Hayes, reading every flicker of emotion that crossed the old operative's face. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in under the weight of whatever was about to be said. Reyes remained standing, arms crossed, his eyes sharp. He wasn't rushing Hayes. Men like him didn't speak easily, not when the truth was this dangerous. Where did he disappear? Trump's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, like he already suspected the answer would change everything. Hayes exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, as if he could see the past playing out like an old film reel. "You think this is about one man?" Hayes shook his head. "Shadow 1 didn't just vanish, he was erased. And if you keep pushing, you're going to find out why no one was supposed to look for him." Trump didn't flinch. "I'm already looking." A humorless chuckle escaped Hayes. "Yeah, I figured." He reached over to a wooden cabinet, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved a thick folder, weathered, the edges curling, the paper inside yellowed with age. He tossed it onto the table between them. Reyes stepped forward first, flipping open the cover. The first thing Trump saw was a grainy black and white photograph. A younger man, sharp eyes, squared shoulders, standing in a crowd of nameless agents. No caption, no official markings, just a ghost in an old file. "That's him," Hayes muttered, back when he still had a name. Trump scanned the page, flipping through faded documents. The deeper he went, the clearer the pattern became. Secret meetings, classified missions, surveillance logs. But something else stood out. A name, over and over. David Cole. Trump's eyes narrowed. "This is him." Hayes nodded slowly. "His real name." Reyes, still scanning the files, suddenly froze. His jaw clenched. "Wait." He lifted a document, one that wasn't like the others. A government memo, redacted in parts but still revealing enough. Trump read the words aloud. "Subject deemed a national security threat. Termination approved." Silence. Hayes tapped a finger on the paper. They didn't just make him disappear. They made him a target. Trump clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the file. David Cole hadn't just vanished, he had been hunted. And if they had tried to erase him, it meant one thing. He knew something that could still shake the foundations of power. This wasn't just about finding him anymore. It was about finishing what he had started. Trump stared at the memo, his fingers pressing into the paper as if trying to squeeze the truth out of it. A termination order. The government had marked David Cole, a man who had given everything for his country, as an enemy. The weight of it settled in his chest like a stone. That was one of them, Reyes muttered, flipping through another document. He wasn't a traitor, he was a shield, and they turned their weapons on him. Hayes exhaled sharply. David was digging too deep. He found something big enough that they couldn't risk him talking. That's why they erased him. They couldn't kill him in broad daylight, not after everything he'd done, so they buried him in shadows. He paused, his gaze meeting Trump's. Until now. Trump's jaw tightened. The pieces were fitting together now, but one thing remained unanswered. Was David Cole still alive? Reyes pulled out his phone. If they wiped him from the system, there's only one way to find out. Minutes later, they had a location. A name buried in old property records, a cabin deep in the outskirts of Chicago. 3 nights later, Trump and Reyes stood at the edge of a narrow dirt road, the cold wind cutting through their coats. The cabin was small, barely visible in the darkness, but the dim glow of a lamp inside told them they weren't alone. Trump took the lead. He didn't hesitate. His knock was firm. No answer. Then, after a long pause, a faint click. The door cracked open. And there he was, David Cole. The years had carved lines into his face, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, hadn't dulled. He studied Trump in silence, measuring him, deciding. "I've been looking for you," Trump said. Cole didn't move. "I know." A beat passed before he pushed the door open wider. "If you came this far, you must want answers." Inside, the room was sparse. A wooden table, a chair, a metal box sat in the center, its lid slightly ajar. Old files, secrets locked away for decades. Trump sat across from him. "Why did they come after you?" Cole leaned back, his fingers drumming against the table. "Because I found proof, evidence of corruption that ran all the way to the top. I thought if I gathered enough, I could bring them down." He exhaled. "But I was wrong. The moment they realized how close I was, they made me disappear." Trump didn't blink. "You're not disappeared anymore." A flicker of something, hope, maybe, crossed Cole's face. Trump reached for the metal box. "Let's finish what you started. A legacy restored." Days later, a press conference was held outside the United States Secret Service headquarters. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned in. Trump stepped forward, and behind him stood David Cole, no longer a ghost, no longer erased. "Today," Trump said, his voice steady, "we restore a man's name, a man who gave his life to protect this country, a man who was forgotten, not by history, but by those who feared the truth." He turned to Cole. "America should have never forgotten you." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. Then, applause, a long, rising wave of it. And just like that, David Cole was no longer a secret. The past had finally been brought into the light. The final message. David Cole's story isn't just about one man. It's about how easily truth can be buried when power is at stake. It's about how those who serve, those who sacrifice, can be cast aside the moment they become inconvenient. But, more than anything, this story is about the power of remembering. Because a forgotten hero is only lost if no one fights to bring them back. If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Share it, talk about it, because in the end, justice only exists when someone refuses to let it be erased. The lesson for today. David Cole's story isn't just history, it's a reflection of what still happens today. People who stand for truth, who challenge corruption, who dedicate their lives to something bigger than themselves, often find themselves cast aside. It happens in politics, in business, in everyday life. Hard-working individuals get overlooked, silenced, or erased when they become inconvenient. But the lesson here is clear. Truth only survives when people refuse to forget. In our daily lives, this means standing up for what's right, even when it's easier to look away. It means recognizing those who sacrifice for us, veterans, whistleblowers, the people who work behind the scenes without seeking recognition. It means refusing to let injustice go unnoticed, whether in the workplace, in society, or in our own communities. Most importantly, it's a reminder that one person's effort can bring change. Trump's determination to find Cole didn't just restore a name, it exposed a deeper truth. And in our own lives, sometimes all it takes is one voice, one action, to make a difference. The question is, when the time comes, will you stand up, or will you look away?